Kristen Atchison here, and we're on our third lecture about psychological disorders. Right now, we're going to talk about mood disorders. So, we all have swings in our mood. Sometimes we're happier, sometimes we're sadder. That's normal. But just like our definitions for other psychological disorders, mood disorders really need to have these persistent disruptions in mood or emotions. And again, we need to have that impairment of functioning for it really to be disordered. So again, it's got to be disruptive in the individual's life. It's got to be maladaptive. It's got to cause impaired functioning, whether it be cognitive, behavioral, or physical. And the two main mood disorders that we're going to talk about are major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. And they really have different ways that they look and different ways that they cycle. So this is a graph that's going to show kind of the cycles of mood disorders, examples of how they can cycle over a 12-week period. So bipolar, and notice that we have 0 is in the middle. So 0 is kind of baseline, 0 is that comfortable feeling. So for a bipolar individual, we're going to see cycles that'll go from manic to depressed, so above baseline to below baseline, above baseline, below baseline, and above baseline again. And this is just an example. We can have people that are bipolar can do fast cycling, where these switches in behavior can happen more short term, not necessarily over the course of weeks. And we can have, or what's called rapid cycling. We can also have this more traditional cycle where we have kind of a period of weeks of one way versus another. Major depressive disorder compared to bipolar, most of the time that individual is going to be below baseline in terms of mood because this is a depressive mood disorder. Occasionally we may be at baseline or slightly above, but as you see here, there's a period of marked depressed mood underneath baseline pretty dramatically, and then back up to kind of a more normal range of emotions where we're seeing slightly below baseline, slightly above baseline, which would be more of a period of stability, as opposed to that period where we have this marked depression. Again, these are just examples of how these can cycle for different individuals, but you can see how these swings in these disruptions in mood really could affect functioning, cognition, behavior, physical functioning, because again, these are marked differences in mood, and they're persistent. They're over the course of several weeks. So the DSM criteria for major depressive disorders, in the first, we need to have one or two of the first two, which we need to either have depressed mood most of the day, or either one, this marked diminished interest in pleasure and activities. So not only depressed mood, but a lack of interest in the things that they normally are interested in. So we need to have one of those or both, is the first thing. Plus, we need to have 3 or more of the following symptoms. And this is, again, the DSM criteria. So we can have differences in appetite or weight, and this can be a significant increase or decrease. So again, a difference from baseline, a difference from what is typical for the particular individual. Has appetite really gone up? Has appetite really gone down? Because of that, then we'll see shifts in weight. Insomnia, or sleeping too much. So again, we're having big shifts in sleeping patterns. Are we sleeping too much, or are we not sleeping enough, or disrupted sleep in another way? We can also have this physical agitation or lethargy. So again, we're having differences in the physical activity level of the individual. So lethargy would be really diminished physical activity. Physical agitation would be kind of shaky, kind of moving more. So again, we'll see major differences in that. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. So this kind of constantly feeling tired can be one of the symptoms of major depressive disorder. Now, some of these things can happen and have nothing to do with major depressive disorder. And so that's why the DSM criteria is going to say we need to have one or both of the first two, which are really kind of the main components, the main symptoms of major depressive disorder. But we also need to have 3 or more of these other things to really show how this is being disruptive in the individual's life. Feelings of worthlessness, excessive or inappropriate guilt, daily problems in thinking or concentrating, making decisions. This is going to be that cognitive impairment that we were talking about on the first slide. And we can also have recurring thoughts of death or suicide. We can even include non-suicidal self-injury in this somewhat as well. But again, the main two symptoms are that depressed mood most of the day, or this diminished interest in the activities that they normally found pleasurable, plus showing this disruption in the individual's life. And that's what those other kind of more secondary symptoms would be. Bipolar, however, we need to have these contrasting symptoms. So we'll have both the symptoms of this depressed mood with that can be, again, seen by the things that we saw with major depressive, but also include things like exaggerated pessimism, social withdrawal, that lack of feeling of pleasure, that atahonia that we were talking about, inactivity or no initiative. We talked about that with major depressive disorder. Difficulty focusing, yes, fatigue, excessive desire to sleep, all these things that we were talking about for major depressive disorder will be characteristic of that depressed state for a bipolar individual. The difference is that these individuals not only have the symptoms of depression, but they will be contrasted with a different time period where we have symptoms of mania, which is this euphoric, giddy, easily irritated kind of thing. And we'll have, again, these are going to be kind of opposites of each other, polar opposites, which is where bipolar gets its name. So we can go from exaggerated pessimism to exaggerated optimism. We can go from a lack of feeling of pleasure to a delight in everything. We can go from social withdrawal to hypersociality. So again, it's going from one extreme to another. Inactivity to impulsivity, difficulty in focusing, to kind of the opposite where the mind won't settle down. And then we can have fatigue to kind of little desire for sleep. This isn't necessarily insomnia. This is I don't need to sleep. This is because of this overactivity. We'll see that this little desire for sleep. So again, bipolar disorder is going to be kind of those two extremes. Bipolar disorder, somewhat like OCD, is one of the ones that's kind of become into the vernacular that we talk about when we have, a change in mood, a typical change in mood, a typical mood swing. We may talk about somebody being bipolar. Again, this is not beneficial to either the individual who's having a typical mood swing or an individual that has bipolar disorder. So we, again, being precise in our language and not using these things in kind of a vernacular or slang way is good. We shouldn't do that because, again, it can be harmful for both the individual that's having a typical change in emotion, but also for an individual who really is struggling with the symptoms of bipolar. So in understanding the mood disorders, there's both biological aspects and explanations for these, and these are going to include the typical evolutionary, genetic, brain-body combinations. But just like we talked about with other disorders, there's also social cognitive aspects and explanations as well. And we'll talk about some of those as well, including negative thoughts and mood, explanatory style. We talked about that a little bit already when we talked about optimistic versus pessimistic. We talked about that pessimistic explanatory style and how that's not good for overall well-being. We can also see that this can be a contributing factor to depression. And so we'll talk about that. And we'll also talk about kind of this vicious cycle of depression and of thought. So to look at the genetic component of mood disorders, again, there's a lot of evidence that there really is a genetic influence on depression, particularly bipolar disorder. We can see this both through studies that look at DNA and look at genes that really are kind of flagged for depression or bipolar disorder, and we also see it in twin and adoption studies where we're looking at heritability, like we've talked about throughout the course. You can see that bipolar has a huge heritability estimate. We see it's over 80% for bipolar having this genetic contribution, and you'll see that. You'll see bipolar running in families. You'll see a parent have it, and several of the children have it, and again, that's very, very typical because it has such a high heritability. Major depressive disorder still has a good heritability estimate as well. We're kind of in the mid 30s, almost to 40%, but we're going to see that bipolar really has a huge genetic linkage. We can see there's differences in the brain as well. We see that brain activity is really diminished in depressive states, and we see that brain activity is increased in manic states, which is just what you would expect given the symptomology that we talked about in, say, a bipolar or a major depressive disorder. So this is the brain of an individual who is bipolar, and you can see the individual was in a depressed state on May 17th, and their brain really showed very little activity. However, when we were in a manic state on the 18th, this individual had really marked increased activity in their brain. And on May 27th, that depressed state, again, we were seeing diminished activity in the brain. So again, we'll see these mood changes mirrored in brain activity as well. The brain structure can be different for individuals with depression. We see smaller frontal lobes for individuals with depression, major depressive disorder, and we see fewer axons in bipolar disorder. Remember, axons are the part of the neuron that takes the information from one neuron to another neuron. And you can see how this can cause disorders if we have fewer of these things. We also see differences in communication. And this is primarily how, when we get to the therapy chapter, when they're talking about the biomedical therapies and medication, that's what those medicines are trying to do. They're trying to change or help how the brain cells communicate with each other. Because we know of these differences in neurotransmitter function, for things like mania or depression, we'll see that by altering those things, we can kind of change those. Things like Prozac are SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So what they're trying to do is change the way the brain is using serotonin to kind of prevent these depressive symptoms, because we know that serotonin reduced serotonin is one of the contributing factors to depression. So again, when we get to that therapy chapter, when they're talking about using medications, they're using the information that they know about brain disorders and how these neurotransmitters, not brain disorders, mood disorders, and how these neurotransmitters then are being used differently in the brain of these individuals and trying to alter that to alleviate symptoms. So the vicious cycle of depressed thinking, a stressful life event happens. We have that negative explanatory style. We have that pessimistic explanatory style that we talked about in our well-being chapter. Because of that, the individual can be put into a depressed mood. This idea that I'm never going to get over this breakup was the example that we gave in that chapter. That's a really depressing thought. Because of that, because of this kind of these depressed thinking, this negative explanatory style causing this depressed mood, we see cognitive and behavioral changes. We talked about in the emotion chapter that smiling made you feel better and that frowning made you feel worse. And so we see that these changes can happen in the cognitive behavioral level because of these moods. Because of these cognitive behavioral changes, when another stressful event happens, we're less able to handle it. And so it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. The other thing that happens is these cognitive behavioral changes can create other problems in and of themselves. So because we're having these cognitive behavioral changes, because we have this depressed mood, we may be kind of isolating ourselves from social settings, from our social network that's a support system. And so that creates stressful situations in itself. And then it also creates a situation where the stressful events happen, we're less able to cope with them because we've taken one of the tools out of our tool belt, which is that support system, as we've talked about. So again, this depressed thinking can be a perpetuating cycle where it kind of can exacerbate itself because of these things. When I was a mental health caseworker, one of the things that we would try and do is try and teach coping mechanisms that kind of worked on these cognitive and behavioral changes. So, when something bad happens and you're upset or you're depressed, try to even if it's just go, for a walk around your apartment building. That's not a lot of steps, but we know that exercise releases the good neurotransmitters. Working on that negative explanatory style, that was something that we worked with individuals. Looking at the other side of it, looking at it from a different perspective, trying to find the good in that situation instead of just focusing on the bad. Because again, we know that this vicious cycle of depressed thinking is problematic. And so we would work on these behavioral changes with individuals so that we could kind of aid in their improvement of their symptomology. So suicide, we're pretty familiar with this because it is something that we talk about in our culture. And it's a person's desire for death. And it really happens when the fundamental needs are somehow hindered. This can really be things that including the need to belong or the need to connect with others. So that isolation can create this suicidal ideation. The other thing that's often creates this suicidal ideation is this kind of not feeling effective, not having self-worth, not feeling that they're contributing in some way, or having this influence on others that they don't matter. And so again, we'll see that can create suicidal ideation. If someone or yourself is talking about suicide or thinking about suicide, being listening and empathizing is really good, because then we're working on that first one, that needing to belong or connect with others. If you're listening to that individual and you're trying to be empathetic with them and to understand how they're feeling, that works on one of those first kind of causes. Definitely connect them with suicide prevention helplines. Again, Georgia State has counseling centers available to you all as students. And for those with immediate risk, really get aid from medical professionals. This can be as simple as calling 911. This is definitely something that I had done as a mental health caseworker, have called, and actually as a friend as well, have called 911 for an individual who was, in this situation. And it's really, it may not feel like the best thing, and they may be unhappy with you for that. But it's not a risk that you should have to take on. You should, be able to get this person the support that they need, and that really is care, and it really is helpful to that person, whether they see it or not. Non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI, includes cutting, burning, or hitting oneself. This can also include things like pulling out hair, inserting objects under the nails or skin, getting tattooed. Again, anything that's really creating injury or pain. So this is not getting tattooed for decorative purposes. This is someone who's getting tattooed because they think that they need the pain. They think they deserve the pain. So this is not an issue of tattooing. This is an issue of that pain piece of it, that injury piece of it. People who engage in this tend to experience bullying and harassment. They don't tend to have the kind of coping skills needed to handle this additional stress, and to be able to regulate their emotional stress in a healthy way. These individuals are often very self-critical, and they have poor communication and problem-solving skills. We don't know all of the reasons. There's an article that came out not long ago that is under supplementary content for you to read on non-suicidal self-injury. This is something that is a newer thing that, it's not that it's newer, it's just a newer thing that has been researched and looked into and trying to figure out the causes of it. And one of the reasons that they think this may be happening is that individuals are trying to distract themselves from these intense negative thoughts. That the pain is a way to stop that thought process, to stop those negative, harmful thoughts. It can also be as a way to attract attention or possibly get help. I've known of individuals, who've gone in and cut themselves on their arm and then come out and said, "Hey, look what I did." And so this can be a way to be a call for help. But often these individuals don't want other people to know that they're doing this, and so they may wear long sleeves. They may do it in places that they can't be seen. Sometimes it can be a way to relieve guilt for punishing themselves. It's a way for others to get others to change their negative behavior, again, as a kind of a manipulation. And unfortunately, because this is something that we're seeing an increase in, it can be a way to fit in with a peer group as well. If one individual is doing it, and this is usually seen more with teenagers, another individual might do this. So again, we can see that as a possibility as well. Okay, well, that ends our discussion of mood disorders, and I will see you in class. Thanks.